And welcome to this, the first talk in a series of about 5 or 6 this spring semester of the 2000 Sagan National Colloquium. Title overall here for this colloquium, The Place of Waste, Exploring Asian and Western Perspectives on Waste, Sustainability, and the Environment. This particular national colloquium was organized by Jim Peoples, who's sociology and anthropology, but also the interdisciplinary East Asian studies. And also Nick Crane, who's in geology and geography. Both of them have done a lot to pull this together, and some related things we've been doing starting last fall. I'm John Krieger. I'm also geology and geography and environmental studies. The SNC, the Sagan National Colloquium, has been modified this year. It normally happens in the fall. It normally has many more talks. We've actually sort of diffused it a little bit. We had some things happening in the fall related to this topic. We'll do some this spring. We have tried to focus on East Asian studies and East Asian topics as well as environmental studies and bring those together. We had a symposium last fall. There's been some travel. There actually are more travel opportunities this coming summer. This is all, in the end, a bit of an experiment. And the experiment is to mix up the SNC with a grant we got from the Luce Foundation. And this foundation was interested in sort of seeing approaches to integrating the study of the environment, but also East Asia. And as the talks progress, we'll go through a series of talks, some focused in different places in the world, but ending up with several talks about East Asian environmental issues. All of which, including the talk tonight, are focused on the topic of waste, which we thought was a good way to focus a broad topic of sort of environmental issues in general, West, East. Waste, something we encounter every day. This is something that's a daily encounter, something we have to deal with on a daily basis. It's practical. There's a lot of practical issues around waste. Also very academic, lots of interesting social and cultural and political aspects to that. And I think there really has been in the last year or two, I've noticed a real increase in interest in what you can call waste or discard studies. This is a growing area of inquiry in the academic world. So watch for more speakers coming up. Tonight, a good way to start, a great way to start actually, Sarah Moore, who's in the geography department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Sarah has been engaged with the geographies of waste for quite a long time, stretching back to her graduate work on the politics of waste in Oaxaca, Mexico. She's also published research on urban gardens, indeed a pretty important article written on urban gardens in Columbus back at the early part of the 1900s. And I think in some ways with Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought you were 118 years old. Now, both urban gardens and sort of discard studies are things that right now are very cool, and she really anticipated this interest, I won't say back in the early part of the 20th century, but back a lot further than a lot of people were doing these things. She is also the co-author of a very cool book I use in one of my classes. The students seem to enjoy reading, which is rare to say about a textbook. It's called Environment and Society, A Critical Introduction. So tonight, Sarah will be talking about a recent project she's engaged with. It's funded by the National Science Foundation, so I think this is sort of the beginnings of a project. And the title is Tracking Transnational Hazardous Waste Trading, Methodological Problems and Partial Solutions.
Are you getting me here? Okay, good. All right, thanks, John. Thank you all for coming tonight, and I want to thank Jim Peoples, Nick Crane, and John Krieger for inviting me to be part of this series, the Sagan Colloquium, on waste. What I want to talk about tonight is, as John said, is a project that I'm doing currently, and I wish it was something I'd just started and I'd made as much progress. It's actually something I've been struggling with for a long time, and so I'll talk about some of the reasons why it's been such a struggle to get to the point that I'm at now as I go along. I'd like to start with an excerpt of an email that I received from the Inspector General, the Office of the Inspector General of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And to me, there are a couple of things that jumped out from this email to me that I kind of took note of. And the first was simply that what prompted their communication with me was that I had requested through Freedom of Information Act processes information or data on the trade in hazardous materials between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, so among the countries of North America. And so the first thing that struck me about his email was the fact that it was my FOIA request that actually caused the agency to digitize this information. So literally what they provided me with in the end were scanned PDFs of files that had just been sitting in a box in what they told me was a non-climate controlled room. So data that was sitting around but was in some sense waste itself, had not been put to any use at all or analyzed. The second thing though, and the one that's more telling in some sense, is the last sentence of this email, where he asks if we had performed any analysis that might inform them in their work. And their work as the Office of Inspector General of the US EPA was to figure out how well their regulations were doing in terms of tracking and modifying the shipments of hazardous waste. So the EPA is writing to me asking, hey, how are we doing tracking hazardous waste? And I'm like, I don't know, guys. This seems like something you should know. So what this points out to me, and this is not to vilify the EPA at all, there are lots of things I admire about the work that they do, both on a federal level and at various agency scales. But what it illustrates, I think, in part, is that despite the fact that these days, well, recently, for example, we have some suspicion, perhaps, that agencies like the EPA aren't doing their jobs. Things like stories coming out of Flint that tell us there's actually a lot of stuff going on here that might be problematic. But overall, on the other hand, oftentimes as US citizens or people who live in the United States, we often think about it as a highly regulated environment, a place where, of course, environmental problems are carefully tracked, carefully managed, and we sort of know everything there is to know about them. And that's just not the case. So one of the things I want to do tonight is really talk through why that's not the case, some surprising things that get revealed once we start to pick apart that data, collect and pick apart that data, and then propose some ways that we can put findings in front of people so that they say, hey, okay, sort of surprising what's going on here. There's an element of surprise in that work. So I started out this project with some very basic questions, and to be honest, for me, this was research that came out partly out of my longstanding interest that John mentioned in waste, politics surrounding waste management in lots of places in the world. But it also came out of a very naive question. So I'm sitting at my desk one day thinking, hey, I'm gonna go teach class, and wouldn't it be really cool? I think I was teaching World Regional Geography, or one of those courses that a lot of geographers teach once in their lifetime at least. And I wanted to see where the waste was going in the world. So what were the transfers of hazardous waste, the flows of hazardous materials around the world? And I thought, I'm just gonna Google a map, and then I'm gonna show my students a map, and they're gonna be like, wow, that's good, or that's bad, or whatever they're gonna be like, but they're gonna see it, right? Impossible. Those data don't exist. So over a series of attempts to find good data on the international milieu, what was going on internationally in a global sense, I ended up finally restricting the project to the countries of North America, and that's partially a data availability issue. It's also partially about where I have a history of doing research. But the questions that I really started with were basic. What materials are flowing from site to site within North America, among the countries of North America, and then a little bit more sophisticated question of how might that have changed over time. So I was interested originally in how things like regulation, or how things like the state of the economy, or the geopolitical situation might have changed the flows of waste between those countries over time. So in my mind, for example, big event that would have shaped some of this would have been NAFTA, for example, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Did that change the ways that waste flowed across the continent over time? And these were extremely difficult questions, as naive as they were, to answer. And so I think that what I'm proposing tonight is really that there are a couple of reasons that these questions are so difficult to answer, and then some strategies for maybe making them less difficult to answer in the future, but also for posing new questions about the hazardous waste trade. So the first problem that one runs across is something I'm going to refer to as methodological nationalism. And this is not a term that I came up with, but it's one of the methodological issues that I'll talk about that shapes how these questions are sort of asked and answered or not answered over time. So that's one of the, this doesn't really reflect very well on there, does it? But that's one of the methodological issues that I propose as a problem with our understanding of the hazardous waste trade. And I'm going to oppose that in the end to something called cosmopolitan justice. So on the one hand, we have methodological nationalism. On the other hand, we have cosmopolitan justice. And I'll unpack those a little bit as I go on. And then there's a series of what I refer to as spatial fixes and temporal fixes that also get in the way of our understanding of the hazardous waste trade. So I'll explain what those are. And then I'll go to some partial solutions or tactics that I and my research team are using to try to expose some of the myths that we have that come out of bad data on the hazardous waste trade, and to really get people to understand a little bit more about what's actually going on in the trade of toxic materials across the globe. So methodological nationalism. So when I first started Googling, and these, I hesitate to put these numbers up there. They are from a well-reputed or a couple of well-reputed studies coming out of regulatory agencies, but they're a bit suspect in some sense just because data on waste is infamously hard to collect just in general. But if you start to think, okay, well, what's actually going on in North America, you do come across some numbers once you do some digging that say things like more than 1 million tons of hazardous waste are shipped between Canada, Mexico, and the United States each year. Or that all 3 North American countries are net hazardous waste importers. Or that they ship a large proportion of hazardous materials among each other. So the waste, 90% of the waste that they ship to one another. Or more startling, perhaps, that the United States now imports twice as much waste as it exports to Mexico. So in some sense, these are really jarring figures. So why are they jarring? Well, on the one hand, they don't fit common explanations of the waste trade that have come out of international environmental economics or international relations, other fields of study that have proposed models for understanding the waste trade. So they don't fit 2 basic common explanations. On the one side, you have an explanation, and these are 2 sides of the same coin, really. You have an explanation that's based in comparative advantage that's called the first best world in environmental economics. On the other hand, you have something called the pollution haven hypothesis that's called the second best world, or you could just call it the worst world, actually, in environmental economics also. So the comparative advantage argument is basically the idea that there are a lot of countries in the world that either are short on natural resources, in this case, it's been updated a little bit, no longer exploiting environmental resources, so they're going to urban mining. What urban mining is basically taking the stuff out of e-waste that's been shipped to their countries in a lot of places. So that's sort of the comparative advantage, that it actually provides poor countries with a resource that they wouldn't otherwise have to import waste from richer countries. They get natural resources, they get jobs. So that's the comparative advantage argument in a nutshell. There's more sophisticated versions, but just to sort of sketch it out. On the other hand, there's an argument that the pollution haven hypothesis, has anybody heard of that? Pollution havens? Waste havens? No? Okay, So the pollution haven hypothesis is the idea simply that richer countries will dump their waste on poorer countries because it's cheaper to dispose of there, but also just those countries have lax regulations. So we're kind of allowed to export to them. So there's the pollution haven hypothesis, comparative advantage, both of which justify or explain, try to explain, the dumping of waste from richer countries onto poorer countries. And this is a quote from the US EPA from 1988 that says basically, that's on the comparative advantage side. So it says hazardous waste can sometimes constitute raw materials for countries in need of those raw materials. It doesn't say anything about our history of sort of exploiting some of those raw materials from those countries so that they couldn't use them in the first place, but we'll just kind of forget about that. So that's one surprise. It doesn't fit these common explanations. The other surprise is, if you're thinking about a number that says the US imports twice as much waste from Mexico and Canada than it ships to each country, or either country, then we stand back and we look at that and we go, hey, that actually seems like a pretty fair and just distribution of waste. That is to say, well, obviously the US isn't dumping on Mexico, Canada's not dumping on Mexico, everybody seems to be sharing the burden, so to speak. So there's not a question of environmental justice where you might be worried that one country was becoming a pollution haven for another country. So good, okay, all done, we can all go home now, no problem here, right? So those are two things that are surprising, is it doesn't really, it's surprising in those two ways. Like it seems just and it doesn't fit explanations. So if you step back and you think about, well, if this is true, to the extent that it's true that the US imports more waste than it exports, or that we don't, we have sort of a vibrant economy between the US, Mexico, and Canada, but that it doesn't constitute a waste haven, then you could actually say, well, maybe it's the history of regulation itself that has provided that current situation. So it's actually work that's been done by international bodies over the last couple of decades that have regulated the flow of waste, that have produced that just outcome, that have made it impossible for wealthy countries to dump on poor countries. And to some extent, there's a really good argument for that. So have people heard of the Basel Convention? So the Basel Convention is really the main international instrument aimed at preventing wealthy countries from dumping their waste in hazardous countries. And so it created a couple of different annexes, said if you're a country that is at a certain level of development on one of these annexes defined in this one category, then you can't ship waste to a lesser developed country. So it actually, in some sense, prohibited or at least discouraged the shipment of waste to poorer countries from wealthier ones. So you can step back and say, well, if we don't do that anymore, great. It seems like that might have worked. A couple of problems with that in the US context. So the US context is shaped somewhat by NAFTA, as I mentioned before, the North American Free Trade Agreement, a series of side agreements that went with that that are codified in what's called the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which do determine some waste trade. But the US, despite being the world's #1 producer of hazardous waste in the world, is not a participant in Basel. We have signed it, but we never ratified it. So it's not like Basel has determined what the US has done. There are certain kinds of international standards that it's created, and the US follows some of those, but it's not a party to the convention itself. So you can't say that particular regulation determined what the US did. So what does the US do? Well, the US created a series of regulations right on the heels, excuse me, of other sort of environmental regulations like the Clean Water Act, et cetera. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is the act that determines both what hazardous waste is and how it's tracked. So these are a couple of definitions of hazardous waste, the official definition, the website definition. So the EPA has a couple of jobs here. And one of them is to define, create regulation around this to try to protect the environment from hazardous waste. The other job that you see communicated a little bit more in the website translation is to educate companies who are shipping waste on what they should do, right? Make sure they're aware of the regulations and can be in compliance with them. But you notice a couple of things. You don't need to read through all of these definitions necessarily, but A couple of things that are sort of interesting about hazardous waste as defined by RCRA. So first of all, it's solid waste, even if it's in liquid form. So if you read down further, it could be a liquid, it could be an ash, it could be a gas. But these are all categorized as solid waste just because of kind of quirks of how we describe waste materials. And basically, when it comes to the end, waste is listed as is hazardous because it's listed as hazardous. So there's no sort of scientific threshold for something being hazardous or risky. It's just that it happens to appear on a list of hazardous materials that in the end is why you consider it hazardous. This has some ramifications for how we study waste, how we track waste, as well as how we might think about some of the risks posed by materials that are either determined to be hazardous or not hazardous. But it's, anyway, it's not a very scientific definition in some ways. It has a lot to do with the way that categories are created and competed over. In the case of RCRA, one of the things that I was interested in, because I'm really interested in waste going from one country to another among those countries of North America, were its regulations having to do with shipping waste between countries. So it tracks waste that come into the United States or waste that go out of the United States through various mechanisms that I'll talk about a little later. Import consents and reports, shipping manifests, those kinds of things. So when you kind of sit down and look at this, right, it's whatever's on the annex that's hazardous. It can be a little bit, makes you want to pull out your hair. So this is actually part of a graphic adventure story written by one of my students that I'll talk about in a little bit. But she's just sort of listing the fact that there's all these regulations about what's hazardous, what's not. Doesn't seem to have much to do with the actual qualities of the waste itself overall. And that really, if you look at the user-friendly hazmat guide, it's 118 pages long, right? It's over 100 pages long, the user-friendly version of what a hazmat is. So these are some things that are sort of out there in terms of the regulatory milieu around hazardous waste in the United States. That I think hamper a more critical understanding, so that's what I want to turn to now. So you can think about, okay, there are all these regulations. Maybe they've had some effect on the fact that poorer countries don't receive as much waste as they may have in the past from richer countries. We don't really know because we don't do a great job of tracking the US. We don't do a great job of tracking either Hong Kong or mainland China. So there are a lot of really significant hazardous waste trade flows or potential flows out there that we have actually no idea about. But there's also this underlying problem. So what I mean by methodological nationalism, that term I've pointed to a couple of times, is that we take the nation state, the scale of the nation state, the scale of the country, as the only relevant actor in international transactions. What does that mean? That means that it smooths over the space of the nation. That's one of the spatial fixes I'm talking about. So it makes it seem, it doesn't distinguish by localities. And remember, one of my first questions was really, what materials go from locality to locality, from city to city, or from state to state? Ohio, huge hazardous waste importer. But you wouldn't know that if you just look at national level statistics, right? The idea that the nation is the only scale of analysis for transnational activity is hugely problematic. Because the nation is a bunch of unevenly developed spaces, right? It's made up of a bunch of localities, of a bunch of states that may be differently affected. It also, this sort of idea that we're operating at the national scale tends to have another spatial fix attached, which is that it distances us from what might be happening in our own communities and from nearby locations that are becoming local waste havens, even if they're not national waste havens. So those are a couple of the things that I want to attempt to reveal a bit in the work that I do. So this is so ingrained, right? So if you're saying, I go to the EPA and I say, well, I want to know what particular materials are shipped from this plant or this zip code to this other zip code. And I think this was like 2007 or 2009 that I went to the EPA and said, I want to know this. They said, okay, we'll collect that data for you. So what they did was went to all their regional EPA offices. They don't know at a national level. They went to all their regional EPA offices, state EPA offices, and collected data. What did they do? They aggregated it back up to the national scale when they sent it to me. So I got something that said, the US imports X and such, Mexico imports X and such, Canada imports X and such. Had no local data attached to it. So this idea that the transnational trade just happens between these countries that have no sort of other places within them is really ingrained. So I had that problem with my first Freedom of Information Act request that I overcame by being in conversation with the EPA a little longer and figuring out exactly what I needed to request and being very specific about it. Okay, so if you think about this problem in methodological nationalism, I've attempted to get some data that I'll show you in a minute that might undermine that as a potential prohibition to understanding the trade. Then there's also a question of, well, cosmopolitan justice. Can we think about how those, how and why waste havens might be created at a subnational level, why there might be waste havens in Ohio, why a certain city or neighborhood might get a disproportionate burden of hazardous waste? Can we evaluate that without thinking about it at the national scale also? So thinking about flows in a different way as the connections between localities rather than something that happens just between nation states. So it's important to think about that with waste because even all that transnational activity, if you're a good geographer or geographically inclined, you know that anything that happens on those larger scales actually always happens in those localities. It's always going on in place. So what's going on in places where waste havens exist? What's going on with public health and environmental health? And can we find and identify those places subnationally? Those are some of the questions I ended up with. So I did receive data from the EPA, and I'll give you the characteristics of that data in a little bit. But the sort of original outlines of the data demonstrate the importance of thinking about it at a subnational level. So you can see very clearly in this map the uneven distribution of the waste economy across the United States. Certain places are much more involved in the waste economy than other places are involved. So this is imports on the left, exports on the right. But what you find is that, so you think about some big, Texas is an anomaly because this only covers 2 years, so it does have some economies, but you think about big states like California, and they're not really that well represented proportionally if you think about them in comparison to places right here in the upper Midwest, right? The post-industrial Midwest. So you see an uneven distribution across the country of these hazardous materials in terms of disposal. But it's not just in terms of, okay, that was by state, so uneven distribution across states, very uneven distribution across states. But it's even more local than that. So it's not just states, but it's particularly communities in particular states, or in this case, a province. So it's not just that it's Quebec, but that it's actually Blainville, which is a very specific community in the outskirts of Quebec that receives a proportion of waste. So it's an extremely localized phenomenon. So we have to get below, we have to get underneath that national level in order to really understand what's going on. So how do we do that? So there's something called brute empiricism, which is the idea that you can just gather all the information about something, put it out there as facts, and kind of know the quality, know everything that's going on. You'll just have every fact at your disposal, and that'll tell you some truth about the world. I don't necessarily believe that that's always the case, so I'm advocating for something I'll call brutal empiricism, which is to take the facts at hand and parse them into stories that tell us a part of the truth, that give us a particular kind of insight into the problem that may help us produce strategically certain kinds of outcomes that we want to see happen, that may help us produce policies or other kinds of outcomes that we want to have happen. So the data that I acquired that I'm using to do this, right, the data that I'm trying to shape towards this brutal empiricism, as I mentioned, come out of FOIA requests. They came from the US EPA's Office of Compliance and Enforcement at the federal level. And what they sent us were compiled data for shipments from 2005 to 2009. Those are export data, so materials that were being shipped from the United States to Canada or Mexico, and then import data that they compiled, from 2007 and 2009. So that first map I showed you was part of their compiled data that they had sent me. They didn't map it, but they sent me the data. The rest of the data that I have are from those PDFs that got scanned as a product of my second FOIA request. So from 2010 to 2012, I have scanned copies of all of the import consent notices, shipping manifests, and annual reports that track the shipments of waste to the United States from Canada or Mexico, or to Canada and Mexico from the United States. It's a lot, okay? So you'll be hearing maybe about big data next year. So I don't have what you'd call big data if you're really a data person, but I have large data. There's a lot of data. So it's a lot of files, and there's a lot of variability between these PDF documents. So they scan these documents and send it to us. Some of these documents talk about one shipment of waste between those countries. Some of them talk about almost 100 shipments of waste between those countries. Things like quantities, containers per shipment, all vary in documents. So it's a bit of a mess. So while I have been working on it for a long time, it's only thanks to the generosity of the National Science Foundation that I've actually been able to have a little more traction on it lately by building a research team that includes a lot of really diligent, hardworking graduate students as well as colleagues of mine to clean up this data and see what it really says. So this is what one of the sheets looks like, just to give you an idea. And this is a shipping manifest. And it talks about exporters and importers, the number of containers. There's a waste code on there, which is specific to the US EPA. And then there's a United Nations waste code also, which is an international code for waste. There's a port of entry. How the waste is going to be managed is down here. And then quantities, descriptions, et cetera. So there's a lot of information in each of these PDFs. And remember, this can be from 1 shipment to 99 shipments. So a lot of different lines of data that can be generated out of each one of these. This is just what a data sheet looks like. So the point there is that it really doesn't tell you much. You can put all the data out, but until you make it speak, it doesn't really say much. So we have that quantitative data. How many pounds or how many kilograms or how many liters of waste are being shipped, how many containers, et cetera. Stuff that we've counted. We also have what we're calling more qualitative data in the data set, because these are forms filled out by businesses, by shippers, or by receivers of waste. And so they often include little notes. This one actually, I don't know if you can read it at the top, but it says, need consent form. So it's actually pointing out non-compliance right there with one of the regulations, which is that you're supposed to have an import consent form from somebody you're shipping to in order for them basically to say, okay, fine, we'll take your waste, right? But they don't have it. The waste still went anyway. So there are lots of little irregularities in that sense, but in notes that you can see that people have written on there. But some of the things we're looking for that aren't as easily quantifiable are things like, well, do they go there for recycling or for disposal? Is it all hazardous waste, or is it being shipped with non-hazardous waste? So this is another problem with some of this project, is that you can ship all sorts of waste together, and they all have different regulatory regimes to which they're subject. And then a category that we found interesting was that US companies that are exporting waste to foreign countries have to justify that. So they have to say why on that form they're exporting it. So we categorized a number of economic reasons that people were shipping waste. Usually it was something about cost efficiency usually. So we qualified some of those data. So as I pointed to, they're not perfect data. Some of the forms are illegible. The EPA, so they told me, okay, great, we've digitized, we scanned these files for you. And as I said, before they were scanned, they were just sitting in non-climate controlled rooms, boxes, as they told me, in non-climate controlled rooms. They're also, so I don't know, a lot of folks in here aren't old enough to remember probably paper contracts and deals, but the ones that have those triplicate sheets that go down, so you're writing on the top, and then you get like to the bottom of the 6th page thing, and it's got a little impression maybe of a mark you made, but you can't really see. So that's what they have. That's what the EPA gets, is the bottom sheet of these carbon copy things. So they've taken the bottom sheet of these carbon copies that are sitting in boxes in non-climate controlled rooms and scanned them for us. So you can imagine, thank God my graduate assistants are young enough that they have really good eyesight and can figure this out, but there's, it's hard. It's a lot of hard work to try to read these documents. There's a lot of illegible and missing information. Sad to say, it's still the best data that we have on this stuff, but it's got problems. So sometimes it's illegible. Sometimes it's missing pages. It'll say page 1 of 2, and there's only 1 page, or page 2 of 2, and there's only the 2nd page instead of the 1st page. So there's some problems. The need consent form is a problem, and there's a lot of inconsistency in the data that the EPA actually compiled and sent us in terms of how things are listed, or even how things are geocoded, how they're attached to a particular latitude and longitude. So some problems. In addition to those kinds of problems, there are ambiguities as well, which have to do in part with that. Remember that kind of screwed up definition of hazardous waste that I told you that starts with solid waste, but then it includes ash and gases and liquids? So that's all reflected in the measurements, but sometimes the measurements get attached to weird things. So you get things that are described as liquid, but they're measured in pounds and kilograms exclusively. You get things that are identified as a different code, but seem to have the same descriptions. So a lot of really confusing information in there. So not very well kept. And then things like mercury is described as a solid measured in pounds, but it's not really a solid. So how does that happen? So some inconsistencies or ambiguities in the data. You also have some place-related ambiguities in terms of border cities. So an import notice is supposed to tell us what US city, for example, is the port of entry for waste coming from Canada or Mexico, but often a Canadian border city is listed, or a Mexican border city instead of a US border city. So some of that geographical data is not as well defined as it could be. And then there's also another question, which is that I asked for data, so I'm just doing North America. So I'm saying, okay, what's going on between Mexico, the US, and Canada? But if you look at the files, there's stuff in there that's coming from Germany, Belgium, Britain, Malaysia, and elsewhere. So part of it is stuff that comes from those places through Mexico or through Canada. So that's one issue. Part of it's just stuff that was misfiled. So just was in the wrong box, right? So, and let me be clear, let me be really, really clear about this, because it's easy to vilify the EPA, and that's not my intention. These people that I talked to on the phone, lots of hours to get this data, were extremely hardworking, dedicated people who thought this was a problem as well, and wished they had the resources to do something about it, but didn't for various reasons. So the EPA regulators that I was talking to were very dedicated, wanted to do this. I'm sure they didn't spend their time going to law school and getting a degree in environmental law because they imagined that they would be scanning thousands of PDFs for some bothersome professor somewhere. So never mind the fact that they were also on furlough. So they were really hardworking, dedicated people. So I'm not putting this on them, but there's just not the resources out there to track a lot of this, which I would argue is a huge problem. And again, some of the other things, like you'd be a little suspicious. These are things that are filled out by people, so they'd have very precise quantities of something, but you'd see those repeated in form after form or year after year, like they'd just taken one and said, oh, well, we'll just stick that quantity in there because that sounds good. Things where they're incomplete zip codes, and things where they're bad address. Okay, so I've got problems. Okay, the data's got problems. So this led to a lot of frustration among some of the people that I have working on it. Again, another piece of work by Chelsea representing some of the problems, missing duplicate entries, not very user-friendly, lots of problems with this data. So if you think about that and you spend as much time as we have cleaning up the data, putting them all in some kind of spreadsheet that you think you can make say something about what the actual flows of these materials are, can the spreadsheet really speak? What you have in the end is a nice spreadsheet. You've got a lot of facts out there, but there's sort of so many facts that if you don't pick a way of analyzing them or a slice to take on it, then you're not really going to understand that much about what's going on. So that's where I came up with this idea I didn't come up with this by myself, but the idea of brutal empiricism applied to this problem. The idea that we're going to take certain slices of these data, reveal part of the problem, and work from there. Hopefully get deeper into the problem as we go on. So one of the things that I like about this strategy is that I'm not trying to make everything transparent. I'd like to do that at some point, but I think that's an unrealistic goal. But really to provoke further questions. It's a strategy to use the data to provoke further questions and hopefully to provoke a productive anxiety among people who look at slices of this data and say, oh, wait, what is going on here? What the heck is going on here? So the way that we've tried to do that is something I'm calling reclaiming representation. That's a tactic that we've tried to use to make these data speak. So there are various ways that we've done this. So as I said, it's about using these data to create new uncertainties, to generate certain kinds of hypotheses that take slices out of things and put them back together differently. And there are a couple of sort of theoretical reasons to do this that are related to the concept of waste itself. So waste is a really multiple object. As you'll see if you come to further lectures in this series, there's lots of ways of studying waste. There's lots of ways of understanding waste. Part of the problem that I come up against in this project is both under NAFTA, waste is both a risk that needs to be regulated, but it's also a commodity that needs to be freely traded, and it's protected that way too. So waste is a really multiple object. There's lots of stuff going on in one piece of waste. So one of the things we refer to that as, because it's constructed in a legal context as well, as a socio-legal object. It's a socio-legal object. Depends on what aspect of the puzzle you're interested in, whether you think of it as a risk or a commodity, et cetera. And so there's several ways of then taking this object and doing analysis that point out parts of the problem. So are there cartography folks in here? Anybody? One cartography person? John knows cartography. But, and I won't go through these in detail, so you don't need to worry about it, but ways of taking different slices that have to do with the scale of the analysis, the orientation of the analysis, that is what part you're focusing on, what particular kind of origins or destinations you're thinking about, as well as the ways that waste is symbolized, and I won't get to that as much, but these are just different ways of slicing the data to make them say something. And these are popular terms in cartography, so something you might know. So it's enrolled differently depending on the scale. The socio-legal object is enrolled differently depending on the scale of analysis. This relates to some of my more theoretical work on waste as a multiple object that I've actually written about that I'm going to skip over here. But it's something that if you're interested in this series of lectures on waste that you might want to reference at some point. So the strategy that we've gotten to are geo-visualizations that take different slices on those terms, a scale, projection, orientation, et cetera. So it provokes a certain number of questions. So one of the questions that I came to this project with, my original question is, who's living with waste? Is there an environmental justice problem? Are certain communities disproportionately burdened with waste? Is that a problem? So if you think about that, then you want to know sort of where the waste ends up, where it came from, how it gets processed once it gets there. So these are a number of small multiple maps. I'm just giving you an idea of the kinds of data you collect here. And then you want to have some socio-demographic data that's associated with that you can perhaps correlate. So the percent minority population in a particular community that receives waste, the racial makeup or the class makeup is what we're really looking for if you're thinking about an environmental justice question, if there's a question of environmental justice. So those are all small multiple maps, not really that interesting, right? Not really. I mean, as maps go. Big whoop. Okay. So this is a much more controversial style of mapping called turn-off faces that tries to put together all of those things onto one map. So you see where the waste comes from being represented by different facial structures. So there's a lot of stuff in this map that is kind of problematic in some ways, but there's a lot of stuff that sort of makes you look at it twice. So this is a turn-off face map that one of my graduate students produced out of the data that we have that talks about all of those things. So it puts together the socio-demographic characteristics, how the waste is processed, if it comes from Mexico or Canada, and all of those questions. As you see, we have an insert of the Lake Erie region, Ohio-Pennsylvania border. I have talked to people in the EPA, and they say, oh, you want to go where all the waste is? Go to Ohio, so just FYI. But anyway, this is just a representation. I'm not going to go through all the things it says, but a way of representing those data that says something. It makes you kind of look twice. So this is something that one of my students put together. But then one of the other things that my colleague and I did was say, hey, you know, we've got a really good resource around here. We have a lot of undergraduates interested in design, graduate students as well, interested in design. So what we're going to do is put that incredibly messy data set in front of them. Oftentimes people in cartography programs or other programs like that don't get a chance to actually work with real world data. So we've sort of put it in front of them, have a messy data set, see what they come up with. What kinds of questions do they ask and generate out of this data set as a way of creating new ways of looking at the data? So we have what we were called a design challenge, where we matched up people who were interested in design or the cartographic representation, the geovisualization, had some skills in that set, with people who were interested in the more human or people environment side of geography. So they worked in pairs, undergrads and graduate students, during the design challenge for one day to come up with some maps. So here are some of the questions that they came up with. So one person was interested in the local distribution of risk within one city. How do we think of that in terms of a classic kind of environmental justice problem? So this is Detroit. What you find is that there is a slightly higher degree of risk associated with poorer communities in Detroit. So that's one question, one scale of analysis. What's going on in one city? How does that affect local communities? Is there an environmental justice question? So remember, all of the waste that we're looking at comes from another country. This is waste that's from Mexico or Canada being disposed of or processed in these types. That transnational thing is important. But how does that affect on a very local scale? What's going on? So that's one question that people came up with. Other questions that people came up with, what are economic development factors associated with this economy? So as I said, it's a risk, but it's also a commodity. What kinds of factors are associated with it as a commodity? So if you look at the places that are importing waste, this is import data, places in the United States that are importing waste, how does their income compare to other areas? And they tend to be poorer areas in general that are importing waste. They tend to have higher rates of unemployment than a lot of other places. So there are a couple of ways you can think about how do they fit into the local development milieu. If you think about then why it might be so important in the post-industrial Midwest, why there might be so much waste here, a couple of reasons. First of all, the sort of history of industry here makes certain kinds of processing more possible. But also historical trade connections mean that we're connected to routes that produce a lot of waste. But it's also the case that it's an important economy, so it replaces some industrial jobs producing things. Disposing stuff is an economy that replaces the production economy in some places. So lots of economic figures. Then you could think about another question. What is the corporate geography of the waste trade? So Chelsea's making the point here, hazmats are really popular. Companies can make a lot of money, not just producing hazardous materials, but also sending them around or disposing them. So it's a significant trade in and of itself. If you look at the data, there are actually only about 3 companies that do most of the hazardous material trading, not just in this region, but in the world. So there's been a lot of conglomeration over the last decade, especially. And they're all called things like clean harbors, right? So clean harbors, hazardous waste, really good. So this is these are clean harbor sites in the United States that deal with hazardous materials, or in Canada as well. So across North America, one company's sort of involvement. How do those flow? You find places that are coming flows that are coming from Canada and Mexico into particular clean harbors areas. So how does that get concentrated in these specific areas? You find one, for example, boat connection from Veracruz, Mexico to a clean harbors facility in the southern United States in Texas. So there's a corporate geography to this that you can also investigate, another slice on the problem. You could ask questions then that aren't so much about the economy of waste in general, but how does waste get processed once it ends up in places, or what kinds of waste are processed in different places. So this is actually, these are maps that go by DOT packing code, and that's a code that is defined by the level of risk associated with the material. And you can see different materials associated with different levels of risk clearly go to different places. So places are subject to different levels of risk depending on what kind of processing they do. So that's an important thing. You could ask, where does waste enter the United States? Border areas, what are the border cities that send it across from Mexico, and then also from Canada. So just to give some slices on how the design challenge students asked different questions, just had this data set in front of them and said, okay, well, now what do I do with it? How do I make it explain something? So I could make it explain, or how do I explain part of it through asking other questions? So what does one corporation do? Or what does it do to the economic development possibilities of a certain location? What are the levels of risk? So those kinds of questions came out of the design challenge. So a lot of information on this one tool that eventually we're going to put back in front of policymakers and regulators and say, hey, is this regulation working the way you thought it would? Is it doing what you want? Does this look like a just outcome to you? Why or why not? So this will be something that is available to the public that I'm also putting back in the hands of the EPA. There's another form of analysis. So remember, this is all about visualizing that data or making that data say something. That's network analysis. Basically, at this point, just proves that places like clean harbors have a lot of the trade. There's a few companies with a high proportion of the trade. So this is also available online. You can pick out some of the nodes. But the basic idea is that you can see in this network analysis connections that mean that certain companies are really commanding a lot of the waste trade. All right, so just to sum up briefly here. The data that we've had to date on the hazardous waste trade across the globe, the transnational hazardous waste trade, has been hampered by what I've termed methodological nationalism. And that this, I've argued, really provides us a sort of false sense of security through 2 spatial fixes and a temporal fix. So the 2 spatial fixes are that if you keep things at the level of the nation, you're really removed from you personally. If it's a national, it's just a process of nation states interactive. It distances us from the local waste havens that might be just down the street or down I-70, for example, or might be in our communities. So that particular scale of analysis, keeping things at the nation scale, smoothing over the space of the nation, means that we don't really recognize those subnational waste havens. We are able to comfortingly So that's one of the problems. Those are the kinds of joint spatial fixes that it has. It also has a temporal fix. So there's a phrase that one of my former colleagues uses, Rob Nixon, called slow violence. And Rob uses that term to refer to things like toxic poisoning of certain kinds of communities. You could think about it actually in terms of what's been going on in Flint recently. But where we put things out into the environment before we really know what their possible effect on public or environmental health is. They're out there, they sort of brew. There's not necessarily, if there's not a catastrophe like there was in Flint, or a kind of preponderance of evidence eventually, then they just sort of brew beneath the surface and we don't really notice them. So this slow violence is really pernicious because it grows and escalates without us addressing it. We need something catastrophic to bring our attention to it. So that's the sort of temporal fix that we have out there. We have all these materials that go out and we don't really know about their impact over time. And we don't track where they go very well, so we can't really measure this impact. So we're trying to get around that in a way as well. And you also have the idea that this is a related issue between that slow violence and then the methodological nationalism. There's this idea that if you bring groups like, not groups, but countries like Canada, Mexico, and the United States into a trade agreement, all of their regulations will eventually be in harmony. They'll be harmonized. So what that means is that they'll all have the same level of regulation. The idea behind that is that then there won't be any reason to send waste or other environmental bads to one place or another. Everybody will just keep their just proportion or whatever. Again, this smooths out the space of the nation. It also says, hey, we're making progress over time. Whereas if you really stand back and you look at the data, you find that there are subnational waste havens, and you find that really that much progress hasn't been made over time. It's just different localities that are being affected by the trade differently. So these are structural problems in understanding what's really going on with the waste trade. And what I've tried to argue here is that we can thus, well, there's structural problems and they're related to these sort of spatial concepts as well as the temporal concepts. So we can use a set of spatial tactics to try to undermine them. So what I'd like to urge everybody to do is think about, or what I've tried to do and that I'd like to urge you to do, is to think about ways that you can understand this data a little bit differently. So what we've tried to do is use design as an attempt to engineer affect, to make people feel anxiety about the problem, to understand the proximity of the problem, and thus want to do something about it. So we're doing that both in terms of our public outreach, but also in terms of our outreach to regulators. What I'd like you guys to do is sort of go to this Choose Your Own Hazmat Adventure game. So go online and check out the Hazmat Mapper and see what you find and if anything's interesting or surprising to you in that data. Thanks.
So you mentioned towards the beginning that as far as regulations go, you get some pretty sizable documents that are not very accessible or not very user-friendly.
Right.
And you also mentioned how some of the terminology that's used to classify hazardous waste and such isn't as scientific, I guess, as you would like to see. And so what I'm curious is, have there been cases where things that researchers today would consider waste and things that should be tracked, but they aren't because it's not currently recognized as hazardous waste? Like, is the rate of, like the regulation reform matching the current rate of research development?
That's a really good question, and it brings up a lot of sort of related issues. I think that regulated, that are not one of those annexes. So if you think about one of the side projects I work on is history of batteries and battery disposal. So there's a lot of work on electronic waste, which has provoked a lot of regulation over the last decade because there's been so much of it, and because that trade has really been, in some sense, abused to the detriment of particular countries and particular sites and countries. But if you think about batteries, just a regular old standard batteries that you take out of your, what uses batteries? Lithium uses, but you have the TV remote, whatever it is. There's one in here, I'm sure. But they're not regulated in terms of, they're not hazardous materials. A lot of people will tell you they're hazardous and that they should be disposed of properly. There are battery recycling sites, but they're perfectly legal to put in solid waste dumps. So that would be one thing that people might argue about. Historically, there's things like BPA plastics, which were not listed. So there's differences between the countries as well. So, for example, there was a disposal site in Canada that was importing a lot of plastics that had BPA in it, and Canada, the region, the provincial government actually decided that that was hazardous, and therefore what that meant was that that dump site couldn't import those wastes anymore because it wasn't designated to handle hazardous materials. But because that would undermine their profits, they were able to argue against that being classified as a hazardous material, simply in order to maintain their trade in that material. So there's a lot mixed up in that, but there's a real difference between sort of the industry that's shipping all of these wastes around, a real disconnect between that, the actual, any kind of scientific level of a measure of risk, and what's going on in the policy. Definitely still a disconnect. Yeah. Do you still have me mic'd? Is this okay?
The mic seems to have gone out, but I can't, if you give it to me,
Do you
I
want me
can
to
see.
use this?
Sure, that'd be great.
The Q&A?
Is this on?
Okay, there we go. I was just wondering if you have taken any look at the actual workers in these spaces, such as Clean Harbors. I actually know someone who works at a Clean Harbors plant, and I have known him for a long time, and I never understood why it was he told me if I ever needed to get rid of a body, he could do it for me. Now I know why. But there is a lot of interaction between just the basic worker and these chemicals every day. He often gets sent home from work simply because there's a chemical fire releasing noxious fumes, and he's not allowed to work that day. So I'm wondering about the impact of these people in these very specific locales, and also the sake just of transporting it. I mean, it interacts with so many people on so many levels. Perhaps it's too specific, but I mean, has any of your graduate students or anybody you pose this question to thought about doing an ethnography of perhaps the workers, the people who actually handle these materials?
Yeah, so absolutely. So a couple of things there. So the remember I said this was sort of came out of a naive question. So I had no idea that it was going to take me 9 years to get a partial answer to this question. But for me, it was really, and that was naivety on two counts. One, that I thought the data would just be out there, and two, I'm not a very good cartographer, so I didn't know that it would be hard to actually flow map, but apparently that's a thing. It's really hard. So, so it's taken a long time to kind of get to this point in the data. My original reason for doing this was precisely to do a deeper, if not ethnography, in places where there are a lot of hazardous materials concentrated, at least a more typical environmental justice question about which specific communities were being affected, what the particular, local regulatory milieu might be that produces this place as a waste haven, as well as the toxic materials that were in the environment. So that was my original desire behind the study, was actually to do some of those deeper case studies. We haven't done that yet. It's sort of a next step in this project. I would point you to the work of Carl Zimring, who just published a book this year called Clean and White, which is a history of environmental racism. The subtitle is A History of Environmental Racism in the United States. And what he's talking about, so when I say environmental justice, I'm often pointing to an issue where there's a community that has a dump located nearby, right? So there's a toxin that's being distributed into that community and causing problems, cancer, birth defects, et cetera. And so that's thought of as a typical environmental justice problem, that link between a community and being dumped on. But Zimring's work also is talking about environmental justice from the perspective that you're talking about, which is the workers. So who's actually done the labor over these decades dealing with those hazardous materials? Again, in the United States, we tend to think of it as not a problem because we think of it as so highly regulated that of course those people have OSHA safe equipment and we'd never put them in danger. But I think we've learned through a series of phenomenal events over the last several decades that that's not always true, right? So absolutely that's an area for concern, and there is some good work going on out there. Yeah, Jim.
I think one of the big things that struck me in your presentation was there's all this data sitting in EPA offices in triplicate, with the EPA having the last triplicate. So there's a huge amount of data, but the more data there is, the tougher it is to make information out of it. And the harder it is to make information out of it, the harder it is to regulate it. Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah.
Is that your impression?
I think you said much more concisely in about 2 seconds what I was trying to say in about 45 minutes. But that's a good summary of the problem. I think that's really the issue. And so what I'm hoping to do with this then is be able to put it back in front of regulators, in front of the people I work with at the EPA, but also state officials, to ask them, okay, well, now that I can tell this story out of the data, does this fit with what you would assume or what you would like to see? I think it is a big problem. As I said, the EPA, for its part, knows that it's a problem. So they've been trying to produce something that looks like the hazmat mapper that we've been working on, that interactive geovisualization tool, for years, and haven't had the resources to do so. So, or they'd get it to a certain level of development and then the project be pulled for various reasons. So they have an equal amount of frustration in that inability to turn that information or that data into knowledge, and then to turn that into policy action. So I hope that this project is able to contribute to that and at least bring up a conversation about it among people who can make some difference in policy spheres in that way, once you draw those connections between the dots there. There's that, and then there's one up here.
To your knowledge, is there anyone else in the U.S. who's actively working to try and clarify and then make public this information?
To my knowledge, no. But what I would say is that there are a lot of people interested in these kinds of questions. Because of the unavailability of data on it it's just because of the unavailability of data on it. People often approach it from sort of the opposite scale first, which is to say that they look at places with a lot of public health problems or environmental problems and work on sort of a ground scale on environmental justice issues there. And so there's a lot of work that goes into that, and hugely important work. What I'm trying to do is figure out some of the reasons behind why certain places might be disproportionately burdened with waste in terms of the sort of economic incentives as well as environmental regulations or lack thereof that produce that effect. So I'd say there are a lot of people that are working from the smaller scale. This, for better or for worse, is a novel data set, and so it's also, I am literally, because I haven't given this back to the EPA, the only one who actually has this as a data set right now. Does that mean it's the only way to study it or the best way to study it? Not necessarily, but it's the way I'm doing it right now. And so nobody else has that part, but there are lots of other parts that people are doing good work on. All right, next kata. Getting your steps in for the day, Nick.
So I have a question. Is anyone doing research to figure out how we don't have to have this? Like, I mean, is it possible to never have hazardous waste, or is this just, the sad reality of being, in an industrial global world?
Personally, I think it's a sad reality of having an industrial global world. I think if we want to keep the level of sort of mass consumption and production that we have, not only that, but encourage other places that don't currently have that to have that level as our measure of development, then it's inevitable. I think that there are certain kinds of technological change and fixes that people are trying to implement that mediate some of those things, but wouldn't eliminate them. And I think one of the things about waste is, there's so much of it already that it's really a shell game. You're just moving stuff around, but you're never really eliminating it. So even a lot of the waste that I'm talking about that gets, we have waste in our data set that's both recycled and disposed, but those recycling procedures always have byproducts too, so that has to go somewhere. And disposal obviously has all sorts of problems in terms of contamination and ongoing contamination. So what we already have is, I think, enough, even if we didn't produce any more, to make it a persistent problem. They make me uncomfortable too. Right. So the question was about the sort of large garbage gyres in the oceans, for example, sort of that extraterrestrial waste, not on Earth, right? Not on a continent. So I don't personally do research on that. I have graduate students who are really interested in ocean space. And thinking about waste in ocean space and plastics, thinking about how you can measure plastics, document plastics, get rid of plastics that end up in the oceans for sure. So it's an area of concern for a lot of people. And we have some problems with how we deal with that come out of our spatial imaginaries, again, because we've learned to kind of regulate some of this from landed property regimes, and the ocean's a very different space, both in terms of who has jurisdiction over the problem, who has control of the territory, as well as what technologies you can apply. So there are all sorts of political and economic and social questions around that I find hugely intriguing, but are not my area of study at the moment. So.
I had a quick question about the economic, what's the total value of the trade that takes place in this industry of hazardous waste material? And if like we talk about further regulating it, what effect would that have on the local communities, as we mentioned, employment and the other factors? How much of a relation does that have with this trade?
Okay, so the first one was just about the overall value of the industry. Yeah. Which is hard to figure out because the U.S. hasn't had to do any reporting on this. So you could take all the countries that report to Basel and you have a multi-billion-dollar industry globally, again, concentrated really in the hands of a few primary actors. But if you were then to add places that aren't currently measured in those measurements, places like the United States, places like Hong Kong, then you would probably easily triple that figure, triple the multi-billion-dollar figure. It's a huge industry. In terms of local development prospects, there's always, I think, a trade-off between certain kinds of development activities, that is, attracting certain kinds of jobs like waste processing versus having no jobs or having lower paying jobs. And so what you see from some of the work that the students did in the design challenge about those economic indicators is that quite often some local communities are actively recruiting these industries as job creators to their areas. It's, again, I think, a contrast between that short-term payoff, you have people have jobs, and that long-term slow violence that may actually undermine everybody's sort of quality of life in the end. Not just everybody's quality of life, but if you think about certain kinds of the ways in which public health actually affects economic productivity over time may not have as big an economic payoff as you're seeing right now either. So I think it's a good question. I think that to the degree that local communities are attracting those jobs, I guess you have to ask who in those communities are actually recruiting those industries and who's benefiting from them the most is one question. There are also a lot of communities where they're just not aware of the risks because people don't know what's being imported there. So there are some other questions about who makes those decisions, who gets the benefits, and who pays the costs. I saw one more back there somewhere, but... Oh, sorry. Yeah, missed some people.
I was just wondering, as far as, I know that the United States produces like the most waste by far than any other country. I think second is Japan. I was just wondering, like, are lawmakers or Congress doing anything to somehow reduce the amount of waste the United States is producing? Because it seems like it's very unfair with the amount of waste that's coming from the United States and going to places like China and other countries and placing the burden on communities in other countries. And I was just wondering, has Congress ever thought about maybe passing some type of regulation to at least reduce the waste in the U.S. by maybe, I don't know, 1/4 or some type of amount to show that we're making improvement and trying to create justice in the field of waste around the world? Just wondering about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that there are definitely people who are really concerned with mitigating some of the risks posed by certain kinds of waste. But in terms of waste reduction, it's not something that I've seen a lot of people in Congress, for example, take up as an initiative. And you can imagine why it wouldn't be a popular one, because if you think about the kind of development we have in the United States, for better or worse, it really is a mass consumption. Used to be mass production, maybe slightly less production, but a lot of consumption right now. Society still, and that means, at least under current circumstances, that you're going to produce a lot of waste. So most of the policies that I see being created are really about enabling us to get rid of that waste, ship it out of sight, so that it is out of mind, so that we don't think of it as a problem. So I'm not familiar with anybody in Congress particularly who's interested in waste reduction per se, although there are people who are really concerned about public health and environmental questions in their own communities in terms of exposure to toxins who do bring that up. So it's a good question. Lots of good questions.
I was wondering, as you described these spatial and temporal fixes to shuffle waste around or to deprioritize the spatial aspects of it and apply it to time. I think it's important that we know for whom and for what these fixes are for. Are we going to state that outright, or what are these fixes for other than the system? Is there embodied others on the other side of that or not?
I think in some sense the spatial fixes allow all of us to be kind of oblivious to the problem and have some level of false security by not knowing the level of potential problem that exists in our own country, never mind a lot of localities in other countries. I think that in broad terms, I would say that those are fixes that help to perpetuate the system as it is, the regulatory system and the economic system, the trade system of these materials as it is. In terms of actual embodied others, obviously places like Clean Harbor are pretty obvious beneficiaries of the current system and have a lot of clout in a lot of ways to make sure that we don't develop other kinds of regulations or better tracking or more available data to actually demonstrate what might be the trade. So I think there's a sort of a perpetuation of the system as a whole, but there's a lot of individually held power, both politically and economically, that's at work in preserving the current state of regulation. Yeah. Sure. Part of the afternoon, yeah, I have an obligation, but I'll be around, yeah. Yeah, please let me know.
Yeah, thanks for the really wonderful talk. I was curious, because Ohio is a major site for the disposal of waste from gas production, especially in the region, and a field quite a bit as well. And I'm wondering if that fits into the data that you've collected, or if it ends up being exempted from certain types of data collection. So specifically waste from mostly gas, but oil and gas production in the region.
Mm-hmm. So some of the stuff that's in the Ohio data, for example, would reflect things like oil sands outside of Edmonton, Canada, or whatever. Some of those things that come into Ohio from other places that are byproducts of the energy industry. I'm not sure about, for example, fracking debris, the degree to which that's represented in there. Ohio is in part so well represented because a lot of places from Canada ship their waste here. Although it's not shown in my data, those are also places where a lot of other states ship their waste too. And as well as places in Mexico that ship their certain kinds of industrial waste to Ohio because of their disposal capacity. So a weird thing about petroleum, a lot of petroleum related byproducts aren't actually tracked in hazardous materials, basically just because they're not on a list. So they got an exemption from one of those annexes through a lot of industry. advocation. So a lot of that kind of industry isn't actually reflected in hazardous waste data sets. Yeah.